repairing in a jewelry shop. At one point of those early years, I think that I must have had fully 300 watches. I thought I could build a serviceable watch for around 30 cents and nearly started in the business. But I did not because I figured out that watches were not universal necessities and therefore people generally would not buy them. Just how I reached that surprising conclusion, I am unable to state. I did not like the ordinary jewelry and watchmaking work excepting where the job was hard to do. Even then, I wanted to make something in quantity. It was just about the time when the standard railroad time was being arranged. We had formerly been on sun time, and for quite a while, just as in our present daylight saving days, the railroad time differed from the local time. That bothered me a good deal, and so I succeeded in making a watch that kept both times. It had two dials, and it was quite a curiosity in the neighborhood. In 1879, that is, about 4 years after I first saw that Nichols Shepherd machine, I managed to get a chance to run one, and when my apprenticeship was over, I worked with a local representative of the Westinghouse Company of Schenectady as an expert in the setting up and repair of the road engines. The engine they put out was much the same as the Nichols Shepherd engine, excepting that the engine was up in front, the boiler in the rear, and the power was applied to the back wheels by a belt. They could make 12 miles an hour on the road, even though the self-propelling feature was only an incident of the construction. They were sometimes used as tractors to pull heavy loads and, if the owner also happened to be in the threshing machine business, he hitched his threshing machine and other paraphernalia to the engine in moving from farm to farm. What bothered me was the weight and the cost. They weighed a couple of tons and were far too expensive to be owned by other than a farmer with a great deal of land. They were mostly employed by people who went into threshing as a business or who had sawmills or some other line that required portable power. Even before that time, I had the idea of making some kind of a light steam car that would take the place of horses, more especially, however, as a tractor to attend to the excessively hard labor of plowing. It occurred to me, as I remember somewhat vaguely, that precisely the same idea might be applied to a carriage or a wagon on the road. A horseless carriage was a common idea. People had been talking about carriages without horses for many years back. In fact, ever since the steam engine was invented. But the idea of the carriage at first did not seem so practical to me as the idea of an engine to do the harder farm work. And of all the work on the farm, plowing was the hardest. Our roads were poor, and we had not the habit of getting around. One of the most remarkable features of the automobile on the farm is the way that it has broadened the farmer's life. We simply took for granted that unless the errand were urgent, we would not go to town, and I think we rarely made more than a trip a week. In bad weather, we did not even go that often. Being a full-fledged machinist, and with a very fair workshop on the farm, it was not difficult for me to build a steam wagon or tractor. In the building of it came the idea that perhaps it might be made for road use. I felt perfectly certain that horses, considering all the bother of attending them and the expense of feeding, did not earn their keep. The obvious thing to do was to design and build a steam engine that would be light enough to run an ordinary wagon or pull a plow. I thought it more important first to develop the tractor, to lift farm drudgery off flesh and blood and lay it on steel and motors has been my most constant ambition. It was circumstances that took me first into the actual manufacture of road cars. I found eventually that people were more interested in something that would travel on the road than in something that would do the work on the farms. In fact, I doubt that the light farm tractor could have been introduced on the farm had not the farmer had his eyes opened slowly but surely by the automobile. But that is getting ahead of the story. I thought the farmer would be more interested in the tractor. I built a steam car that ran. It had a kerosene-heated boiler, and it developed plenty of power, and a neat control, which is so easy with the steam throttle. But the boiler was dangerous. To get the requisite power without too big and heavy a power plant required that the engine work under high pressure. Sitting on a high-pressure steam boiler is not altogether pleasant. To make it even reasonably safe required an excess of weight that nullified the economy of the high pressure. For 2 years, I kept experimenting with various sorts of boilers. The engine and control problems were simple enough, and then I definitely abandoned the whole idea of running a road vehicle by steam. I knew that in England they had what amounted to locomotives running on the roads, hauling lines of trailers, and also there was no difficulty in designing a big steam tractor for use on a large farm. But ours were not then English roads. They would have stalled or racked to pieces the strongest and heaviest road tractor. And anyway, the manufacture of a big tractor, which only a few wealthy farmers could buy, did not seem to me worthwhile. But I did not give up the idea of a horseless carriage. The work with the Westinghouse representative only served to confirm the opinion I had formed that steam was not suitable for light vehicles. That is why I stayed only a year with that company. There was nothing more that the big steam tractors and engines could teach me, and I did not want to waste time on something that would lead nowhere. A few years before, it was while I was an apprentice, I read in The World of Science, an English publication, of the silent gas engine, which was then coming out in England. I think it was the Otto engine. It ran with illuminating gas, had a large cylinder, and the power impulses being thus intermittent required an extremely heavy flywheel. As far as weight was concerned, it gave nothing like the power per pound of metal that a steam engine gave, and the use of illuminating gas seemed to dismiss it as even a possibility for road use. It was interesting to me only as all machinery was interesting. I followed in the English and American magazines which we got in the shop the development of the engine, and most particularly the hints of the possible replacement of the illuminating gas fuel by a gas formed by the vaporization of gasoline. The idea of gas engines was by no means new, but this was the first time that a really serious effort had been made to put them on the market. They were received with interest rather than enthusiasm, and I do not recall anyone who thought that the internal combustion engine could ever have more than a limited use. All the wise people demonstrated conclusively that the engine could not compete with steam. They never thought that it might carve out a career for itself. That is the way with wise people. They are so wise and practical that they always know to a dot just why something cannot be done. They always know the limitations. That is why I never employ an expert in full bloom. If I ever wanted to kill opposition by unfair means, I would endow the opposition with experts. They would have so much good advice that I could be sure they would do little work. The gas engine interested me, and I followed its progress, but only from curiosity, until about 1885 or 1886, when, the steam engine being discarded as the motive power for the carriage, that I intended someday to build, I had to look around for another sort of motive power. In 1885, I repaired an Otto engine at the Eagle Iron Works in Detroit. No one in town knew anything about them. There was a rumor that I did, and, although I had never before been in contact with one, I undertook and carried through the job. That gave me a chance to study the new engine at first hand, and in 1887, I built one on the Otto four-cycle model just to see if I understood the principles. Four-cycle means that the piston traverses the cylinder 4 times to get one power impulse. The first stroke draws in the gas, the second compresses it, the third is the explosion or power stroke, while the fourth stroke exhausts the waste gas. The little model worked well enough. It had a 1-inch bore and a 3-inch stroke, operated with gasoline, and while it did not develop much power, it was slightly larger in proportion than the engines being offered commercially. I gave it away later to a young man who wanted it for something or other and whose name I have forgotten. It was eventually destroyed. That was the beginning of the work with the internal combustion engine. I was then on the farm to which I had returned, more because I wanted to experiment than because I wanted to farm, and, now being an all-around machinist, I had a first-class workshop to replace the toy shop of earlier days. My father offered me 40 acres of timberland, provided I gave up being a machinist. I agreed in a provisional way, for cutting the timber gave me a chance to get married. I fitted out a sawmill and a portable engine and started to cut out and saw up the timber on the tract. Some of the first of that lumber went into a cottage on my new farm, and in it we began our married life. It was not a big house, 31 feet square and only a story and a half high, but it was a comfortable place. I added it to my workshop, and when I was not cutting timber, I was working on the gas engines, learning what they were and how they acted. I read everything I could find, but the greatest knowledge came from the work. A gas engine is a mysterious sort of thing. It will not always go the way it should. You can imagine how those first engines acted. It was in 1890 that I began on a double-cylinder engine. It was quite impractical to consider the single cylinder for transportation purposes. The flywheel had to be entirely too heavy. Between making the first four-cycle engine of the Otto type and the start on a double cylinder, I had made a great many experimental engines out of tubing. I fairly knew my way about. The double cylinder I thought could be applied to a road vehicle, and my original idea was to put it on a bicycle with a direct connection to the crankshaft and allowing for the rear wheel of the bicycle to act as the balance wheel. The speed was going to be varied only by the throttle. I never carried out this plan because it soon became apparent that the engine, gasoline tank, and the various necessary controls would be entirely too heavy for a bicycle. The plan of the two opposed cylinders was that, while one would be delivering power, the other would be exhausting. This naturally would not require so heavy a flywheel to even the application of power. The work started in my shop on the farm. Then I was offered a job with the Detroit Electric Company as an engineer and machinist at $45 a month. I took it because that was more money than the farm was bringing me, and I had decided to get away from farm life anyway. The timber had all been cut. We rented a house on Bagley Avenue, Detroit. The workshop came along, and I set it up in a brick shed at the back of the house. During the first several months, I was in the night shift at the electric light plant, which gave me very little time for experimenting. But after that, I was in the day shift, and every night and all of every Saturday night, I worked on the new motor. I cannot say that it was hard work. No work with interest is ever hard. I am always certain of results. They always come if you work hard enough. But it was a very great thing to have my wife even more confident than I was. She has always been that way. I had to work from the ground up. That is, although I knew that a number of people were working on horseless carriages, I could not know what they were doing. The hardest problems to overcome were in the making and breaking of the spark and in the avoidance of excess weight. For the transmission, the steering gear, and the general construction, I could draw on my experience with the steam tractors. In 1892, I completed my first motor car, but it was not until the spring of the following year that it ran to my satisfaction. This first car had something of the appearance of a buggy. There were two cylinders with 2.5-inch bore and a 6-inch stroke set side by side and over the rear axle. I made them out of the exhaust pipe of a steam engine that I had bought. They developed about 4 horsepower. The power was transmitted from the motor to the countershaft by a belt and from the countershaft to the rear wheel by a chain. The car would hold 2 people, the seat being suspended on posts and the body on elliptical springs. There were 2 speeds, one of 10 and the other of 20 miles per hour, obtained by shifting the belt, which was done by a clutch lever in front of the driving seat. Thrown forward, the lever was put in the high speed, thrown back, the low speed. With the lever upright, the engine could run free. To start the car, it was necessary to turn the motor over by hand, with the clutch free. To stop the car, one simply released the clutch and applied the foot brake. There was no reverse, and speeds other than those of the belt were obtained by the throttle. I bought the ironwork for the frame of the carriage and also the seats and the springs. The wheels were 28-inch wire bicycle wheels with rubber tires. The balance wheel I had cast from a pattern that I had made, and all of the more delicate mechanism I made myself. One of the features that I discovered necessary was a compensating gear that permitted the same power to be applied to each of the rear wheels when turning corners. The machine altogether weighed about 500 pounds. A tank under the seat held 3 gallons of gasoline, which was fed to the motor through a small pipe and a mixing valve. The ignition was by electric spark. The original machine was air-cooled, or to be more accurate, the motor simply was not cooled at all. I found that on a run of an hour or more, the motor heated up, and so I very shortly put a water jacket around the cylinders and piped it to a tank in the rear of the car over the cylinders. Nearly all of these various features had been planned in advance. That is the way I have always worked. I draw a plan and work out every detail on the plan before starting to build. For otherwise, one will waste a great deal of time in makeshifts as the work goes on, and the finished article will not have coherence. It will not be rightly proportioned. Many inventors fail because they do not distinguish between planning and experimenting. The largest building difficulties that I had were in obtaining the proper materials. The next were with tools. There had to be some adjustments and changes in details of the design, but what held me up most was that I had neither the time nor the money to search for the best material for each part. But in the spring of 1893, the machine was running to my partial satisfaction and giving an opportunity further to test out the design and material on the road. End of chapter 1. Chapter 2. What I Learned About Business. My gasoline buggy was the first, and for a long time, the only automobile in Detroit. It was considered to be something of a nuisance, for it made a racket and it scared horses. Also, it blocked traffic. For if I stopped my machine anywhere in town, a crowd was around it before I could start up again. If I left it alone, even for a minute, some inquisitive person always tried to run it. Finally, I had to carry a chain and chain it to a lamp post whenever I left it anywhere. And then there was trouble with the police. I do not know why, for my impression is that there were no speed limit laws in those days. Anyway, I had to get a special permit from the mayor, and thus for a time enjoyed the distinction of being the only licensed chauffeur in America. I ran that machine about 1,000 miles through 1895 and 1896, and then sold it to Charles Ainsley of Detroit for $200. That was my first sale. I had built the car not only to sell, but to experiment with. I wanted to start another car. Ainsley wanted to buy. I could use the money, and we had no trouble in agreeing upon a price. It was not at all my idea to make cars in any such pretty fashion. I was looking ahead to production, but before that could come, I had to have something to produce. It does not pay to hurry. I started a second car in 1896. It was much like the first, but a little lighter. It also had the belt drive, which I did not give up until some time later. The belts were all right, excepting in hot weather. That is why I later adopted gears. I learned a great deal from that car. Others in this country and abroad were building cars by that time, and in 1895 I heard that a Benz car from Germany was on exhibition in Macy's store in New York. I traveled down to look at it, but it had no features that seemed worthwhile. It also had the belt drive, and it was much heavier than my car. I was working for lightness. The foreign makers have never seemed to appreciate what lightweight means. I built 3 cars in all in my home shop, and all of them ran for years in Detroit. I still have the first car. I brought it back a few years later from a man to whom Mr. Ainsley had sold it. I paid $100 for it. During all this time, I kept my position with the electric company and gradually advanced to chief engineer at a salary of $125 a month. But my gas engine experiments were no more popular with the president of the company than my first mechanical leanings were with my father. It was not that my employer objected to experiments, only to experiments with a gas engine. I can still hear him say, "Electricity, yes, that's the coming thing, but gas, no." He had ample grounds for his skepticism. To use the mildest terms, practically no one had the remotest notion of the future of the internal combustion engine, while we were just on the edge of the great electrical development. As with every comparatively new idea, electricity was expected to do much more than we even now have any indication that it can do. I did not see the use of experimenting with electricity for my purposes. A road car could not run on a trolley, even if trolley wires had been less expensive. No storage battery was in sight of a weight that was practical. An electrical car had of necessity to be limited in radius and to contain a large amount of motive machinery in proportion to the power exerted. That is not to say that I held or now hold electricity cheaply. We have not yet begun to use electricity, but it has its place, and the internal combustion engine has its place. Neither can substitute for the other, which is exceedingly fortunate. I have the dynamo that I first had charge of at the Detroit Edison Company. When I started our Canadian plant, I bought it from an office building to which it had been sold by the electric company, had it revamped a little, and for several years it gave excellent service in the Canadian plant. When we had to build a new power plant, owing to the increase in business, I had the old motor taken out to my museum, a room out at Dearborn that holds a great number of my mechanical treasures. The Edison Company offered me the general superintendency of the company, but only on condition that I would give up my gas engine and devote myself to something really useful. I had to choose between my job and my automobile. I chose the automobile, or rather I gave up the job. There was really nothing in the way of a choice, for already I knew that the car was bound to be a success. I quit my job on August 15, 1899, and went into the automobile business. It might be thought something of a step, for I had no personal funds. What money was left over from living was all used in experimenting. But my wife agreed that the automobile could not be given up, that we had to make or break. There was no demand for automobiles. There never is for a new article. They were accepted in much the fashion as was more recently the airplane. At first, the horseless carriage was considered merely a freak notion, and many wise people explained with particularity why it could never be more than a toy. No man of money even thought of it as a commercial possibility. I cannot imagine why each new means of transportation meets with such opposition. There are even those today who shake their heads and talk about the luxury of the automobile and only grudgingly admit that perhaps the motor truck is of some use. But in the beginning, there was hardly anyone who sensed that the automobile could be a large factor in industry. The most optimistic hoped only for a development akin to that of the bicycle. When it was found that an automobile really could go, and several makers started to put out cars, the immediate query was as to which would go fastest. It was a curious but natural development, that racing idea. I never thought anything of racing, but the public refused to consider the automobile in any light other than as a fast toy. Therefore, later we had to race. The industry was held back by this initial racing slant, for the attention of the makers was diverted to making fast, rather than good, cars. It was a business for speculators. A group of men of speculative turn of mind organized, as soon as I left the electric company, the Detroit Automobile Company to exploit my car. I was the chief engineer and held a small amount of the stock. For 3 years, we continued making cars more or less on the model of my first car. We sold very few of them. I could get no support at all toward making better cars to be sold to the public at large. The whole thought was to make to order and to get the largest price possible for each car. The main idea seemed to be to get the money, and without authority other than my engineering position gave me, I found that the new company was not a vehicle for realizing my ideas, but merely a money-making concern that did not make much money. In March 1902, I resigned, determined never again to put myself under orders. The Detroit Automobile Company later became the Cadillac Company under the ownership of the Lelands, who came in subsequently. I rented a shop, a one-story brick shed, at 81 Park Place to continue my experiments and to find out what business really was. I thought that it must be something different from what it had proved to be in my first adventure. The year from 1902 until the formation of the Ford Motor Company was practically one of investigation. In my little one-room brick shop, I worked on the development of a four-cylinder motor, and on the outside, I tried to find out what business really was, and whether it needed to be quite so selfish a scramble for money as it seemed to be from my first short experience. From the period of the first car, which I have described, until the formation of my present company, I built in all about 25 cars, of which 19 or 20 were built with the Detroit Automobile Company. The automobile had passed from the initial stage, where the fact that it could run at all was enough, to the stage where it had to show speed. Alexander Winton of Cleveland, the founder of the Winton car, was then the track champion of the country and willing to meet all comers. I designed a two-cylinder enclosed engine of a more compact type than I had before used, fitted it to a skeleton chassis, found that I could make speed, and arranged a race with Winton. We met on the Grosse Pointe track at Detroit. I beat him. That was my first race, and it brought advertising of the only kind that people cared to read. The public thought nothing of a car unless it made speed, unless it beat other racing cars. My ambition to build the fastest car in the world led me to plan a four-cylinder motor, but of that more later. The most surprising feature of business, as it was conducted, was the large attention given to finance and the small attention to service. That seemed to me to be reversing the natural process, which is that the money should come as the result of work, and not before the work. The second feature was the general indifference to better methods of manufacture, as long as whatever was done got by and took the money. In other words, an article apparently was not built with reference to how greatly it could serve the public, but with reference solely to how much money could be had for it, and that without any particular care whether the customer was satisfied. To sell him was